changes over time. And this is just a quote from one of the superintendents in our workshop, one of our workshops, that just, for them, gives them a tool to think about climate change in a constructive way instead of being overwhelmed. It helps you parse the information out, allows them to work the issue a little bit so that they can start to see where it fits into their day-to-day activities, without sort of going to this climate scientist, tell us how the future is going to unfold, tell us what we should do. Give some ownership and empowerment to people who have to make the decisions. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. And this is the first one. So one method for doing scenarios in this, what we call the participatory approach. So what we've been working on is using science to inform what the drivers are, what some of the impacts are, but also having individuals who have to make decisions construct scenarios so they get a feeling for, if this varies and that varies, what would we end up with? So one of the ways of doing it is a very simple 2x2 matrix approach. You just take two variables with end members, and you cross them. And then you talk about what goes on in these different categories. So this is not specific, well, it is specific to climate change in the sense that we ask the question, what are the big picture drivers? What are the things, like I talked about before, that affect your ability to make decisions? And this was with a group of managers, and they went through, we listed them out, a bunch of things, and then we started honing in on what are the ones that are the most uncertain and the most consequential. Those are the ones you want to work with the biggest differences. And the ones they came up with are the nature leadership and support on climate change. Like some parks are going, I don't even know if I'm supposed to talk about this. And we don't really know if we should make it a big part of our program. We're not being told. We don't see the leadership. We see disconnected initiatives. We see lack of commitment, varied approaches. People are more interested in short-term issues. So that's kind of the left-hand side of the leadership versus a situation where you're hearing from your boss and their boss and the overall administration that this is important. We're going to align around it. Those are two different situations. So that was one of the axes, long-term perspectives. And then the other one, which you might think is the same, but it is quite decoupled, is what does the public think? So in an organization like the Park Service, it really matters. We manage public lands, and they're not necessarily the same as what the leadership says. So you may have a local public that is very keen on climate change. They see the importance of it. They want to be doing something. And you could have that local public be engaged, and not have senior commitment and leadership or with it. And by the same token, you can have a public that really doesn't get it, doesn't care, and doesn't want to see you tackling this topic. So we've got two axes with these end members, and then you say what happens in the intersection. So you'll see the way we named them over here. When you've got heightened understanding from the public but no commitment in leadership, we called that riots and revolutions. So that's a world in which you have bottom-up innovation because it's your local people that are driving it. You don't really have the top-down structure to work with it, but you've got energy from local constituents. If the public doesn't care and the leadership doesn't care, and you're somebody trying to work on climate change, we called that "Is anyone out there?" Because, and I think many of us have worked on climate change for a long time, have been in that world a lot. We recognize that world. A lot of parks still think they're there. A lot of people, when you ask them, where are you? They still feel like this is where they are. If you're in a situation where, okay, we got a new administration and we've got this big program and we're going to do climate change, and the park is going, my public doesn't really care. I don't really see where it's relevant to me, but I'm just being told this is something I'm supposed to address. And that's a world of intrusive bureaucracy. You're just sort of being mandated to do something that you don't really understand the point of it, right? Versus everybody's in alignment. Leadership is strong. People know this is a big deal. We call that big problems, big solutions. That's when we face it full on and bring all the resources that we have to bear. So those are different decision environments. And we've used this a lot. That's not the only way you could draw this out, but it's just an example of how you can kind of use these variables that really, contribute to your ability to make decisions and what that means. So So the actions that parks would take in those different situations could be quite different, right? Yeah.
How hard is it to get to, I think you said the criteria is sort of most uncertain and kind of
Consequential.
Most consequential. How hard is it to get down to kind of like just two? I mean, I know you can do this a three-way, but it gets a little bit more complicated.
You know,
like
the way you get there, if you may have 3 or 4, and if you've got a group of this size, you can break into 4 or 5 people. You could have, you know, several drivers that people want to work with, and you say, you 5 go off and take these 2 and cross them and experiment. So you simply go work with it for a little bit. Everybody does a different matrix. You come back together and you talk about it. And the goal, if you're using this technique, the goal is to get at least 3, hopefully 4, as in this case, of divergent, plausible, relevant, interesting scenarios. So, you know, you want them to be plausible. They need to be realistic. You want them to be different. You want them to be relevant. And if you can get a set of them and they speak to you and you can work with them, you've got something to work with. And so that's a really important point. It's not saying this is the only, you know, set of scenarios that would be worthwhile. It's just a way of organizing your thinking. And so if it's useful, it's useful. Yeah. But you might have 2 matrices you want to work with. I don't know. I mean, yeah, so we can talk about that. So an application, I'm going to talk now about another application of scenario planning, more specific to climate change and with a given park. So this is Assateague Island. It's a barrier island in the northeast. It is managed, there's the island up there on the right. It's on the island, you have the National Park Service is managing part of it. You've got the Fish and Wildlife Service managing the refuge part. You've got a piece that belongs to the state. So it's a fairly complicated area with people with different missions and different mandates. Sea level rise, as well as human manipulation of the shoreline, which has caused sediment starvation. So those 2 factors together have sort of threatened the existence and the continued existence of the barrier island itself. So they're trying to grapple with a lot of different factors. So some of they've been considered as an island at threshold in the sea level rise assessment, I think, that was done under the climate science program. Assateague was pointed out, and you know, so they face segmentation of the island with storms now because they're right at that threshold. So storms come along and you can break it apart. They face overwash, and sort of migration may happen that pushes them back to the mainland, or just disintegration of it entirely. So they got some issues to deal with, and you know, they've got some species of concern. Obviously, there's a couple of them there, but they've also been doing some pretty creative things. So when we went to work with them, we talked again about what are the issues of concern, and of course breaching and all of that is important. And then what are the drivers? So we did this exercise of what are the drivers. These aren't the only ones, but we ended up sea level rise, obviously. I mean, that's just a huge one. And then for them, the other one was what were the storms, whether it's the nor'easters or the hurricanes that come in, because the storms come in and they're really the ones that drive this. Sea level rise is coming up, you know, and you've got questions about the rate. And ultimately, you're going to have inundation of salt water, and, you know, but the storms are the ones that come in and just reset the whole environment. And so how those interact in the future were the ones. And so they went through this exercise of describing what's happening when you have high sea level rise but less storms, or high sea level rise with frequent storms. And, you know, part of the exercise is naming them. So like with high sea level rise but you don't really get more storms, they just called that drowning in place. It's going to be this creep of change that happens, but not just a big blast. Like if you get those 2 happening together, they called that the sandbar, because they're just going to go from an island system into very fragmented. And so these bullets are kind of what are the things that go along with that. Interestingly, and this is kind of how you can be creative with this sometimes, and this kind of gets at your question, Jeff. One of the other factors that we considered that was really important was just sort of the overall availability of fresh water that they hadn't really thought of that much. So we had another matrix we were working with, and it wasn't as diverse. It didn't have that much going on. But when when we decided to really go with this one, we had this need to still consider fresh water supply. It wasn't something they'd really thought about. And so, we ended up taking this side of it over here and breaking it into two possibilities, where in one case, you've got, let me see which one it is. Yeah, in this case, you had actually variation in precipitation and drought that pushes you into sort of a lowered water table. We brought in the issue of lowered water supply, whereas it didn't play out as a big a factor here. So in essence, we ended up with 5 scenarios that we were able to use. And so I wanted to show you this because this is kind of a toggling that you can do here with yet another factor. So I don't know, is this like really confusing to show this, or do you kind of get the way we're trying to parse it out and get people to think about it? Interestingly, for acetate, that this particular one, parched, was, and in the end they called it parched ponies, because they thought about, what's the bigger environment this plays out in. Well, they've got these acetate ponies they're not native, but they are the resource that people want to see. If you Google Acetique Island, that's what comes up. It's really hard to see photos of other things. So they figured, well, lowered water supply, that's going to be this iconic effect on the animals on the island. And so they've started actually measuring their groundwater now. They didn't even have a monitoring system in place. They really hadn't thought about it. So that was one of the areas that came out that they hadn't realized could be a potential big deal for them. All right, so what do you do when you have that matrix? The next step is to kind of stand back and go, all right, we've got actions. You sort of look at the effects and then you map it to what are the actions we could take under these different situations. So you could list out the actions in each quadrant, and then you sort of think about, all right, how do we want to approach this? Do you do this sort of robust option, which says we're only going to do actions that will work out well in any scenario? Those are the things we're going to focus on doing. Do you decide the bet the farm? Do you say, what, this is the thing. This is what I think is going to happen. So we're going to put all our energy there because we really believe this is the way the future is going. Do you hedge your bets and just say, I don't know, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to wait and see, or I'll do some little things. Actually, this is really what we do. In the absence of this kind of planning, that's generally what we do. It's kind of nothing. We wait and see. More science. But the other is this idea of core satellite, which I think is kind of an interesting one, which says, well, we don't know which way it's going to go. We don't want to bet the farm, but we do want to be kind of strategic. So we're going to focus mostly in one area, but we're going to invest in in some actions in these other areas. We're going to monitor and kind of try to see where things go so that we can recognize if we're shifting into one future or the other. This just allows you to sort of get a strategy. Just some examples of what Acetique actually did, which is kind of cool. They've done several things. They, in their general management plan, are now moving their infrastructure back off of the surf zone. That's fairly logical. And in this map that sort of shows where the high tides or where the storm surges come is what that map on the left is. They're also doing flexible infrastructure. So with bathhouses and things that they put on the beach for recreation, they're doing it in a way that they can then pull them back when a storm's coming or when it's not the right season, instead of putting solid infrastructure in, which we have typically tended to do, and then it gets washed out by a storm, and then we have to go back and rebuild. They're doing it in a way that they can put them in, take them out, and be more flexible so it doesn't cost as much. And the other one that I really like is, the public wants this parking lot in a particular location. It's very hard to say, look, this gets washed out. We can't do it. They want it anyway. So, okay, fine. We're going to use shells. We're going to use materials that you can park on it, but when it gets ripped up and goes back into the surf zone, you're not just putting concrete into the surf zone. So it's more of a sustainable option. So I thought that was kind of cool. And then the other is, a lot of outreach and education. They actually, after they did the scenario work, came to us and said, we really need to know how to communicate these to the public, tell them what it means, and how to get this into our plan. This is sort of using repeat photography as an example of an exhibit where they can sort of demonstrate to people this dynamic nature and the things that they're doing. So communication was a big deal for them. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of other sort of general things that we're working on. Communication is a really big deal for us overall. This is something that's been developed in the last couple of years. These are key messages that were done through our communication work group that we've got on our website that we're now using as jumping off points for parks to develop more specific interpretive displays and programs within their parks. So basically acknowledging climate change is happening, that humans are contributing to that and accelerating it, that it has consequences, that the MPS is responding with practices, adaptation, and mitigation options, you know, and that there are things we can do, that there are choices we can make now that make a difference. So those are interpretive messages that were developed within our interpretation and education branch. I was going to bring stacks of these. These are recent issues of Park Science that were just devoted to climate change in national parks. There was an special issue on adaptation and communication, as well as a follow-on one that was just on the research. These are really nice. These are really good if you have any interest in. These are easy to find on the website. Just you can get to our public site, or you can just Google Park Science, and they're there. And I apologize for not bringing the stacks of hard copies in. And then
climate friendly.
We're being climate friendly. Yeah.
There, you know, they can read them electronically.
You know, these are just sort of little snapshots of projects and stuff, but I really like this one too, that Angie Richmond, who's our communications specialist, and she's here in Fort Collins, is working. We had a number of parks that put proposals in. We fund some projects through our program, and they wanted to do exhibits on climate change in their parks. And so as the Washington office, we were able to go, let's have you guys work together. So we've now got a team specific to sort of coastal impacts that are not only getting their exhibit in their park, but they're using, you know, some information technology, these QR codes that people can link the exhibit that's in Everglades with the one that's in Kenai Fjords, you know, with the one that's in Point Reyes or Golden Gate. So you can go, sea level rise is occurring in a lot of areas. Here's how it's similar, here's how it's different, and start to get more at sort of overall literacy and, you know, broader educational value. So I really like this. I think we're going to be doing a lot more of linking one part to the other. So I really like this particular project. And then I did want to make a pitch for our youth initiative. We have both an internship and a fellowship program, and the call for those is out right now. So if anybody's interested, you can also find that on our website. The internship is really, those are projects that are identified in parks. They say what they want, we approve a list, and then our university partner, which is University of Washington, actually right now, will canvass and find students to match to those projects, and these are usually in parks generally. Sometimes they're in program offices. And then the fellowship are student-defined research projects that we review independently, and you know, it's a fellowship. You get your own funding to do research.
Could you explain the type of students you look for? Like, are they undergraduates, high school, graduates, or what?
So generally, the internships have been undergraduates or master's students, the interns. The fellows are masters or PhD candidates.
Both those people look way too young. I'm thinking they're high school, but I'm just getting old, I think. Sorry.
I understand.
Good.
Yeah. And one quick slide to just show you some of the folks that are in our office in Fort Collins. We have some folks in Washington, D.C., and then we also support what we call affiliated staff, which are positions that are out in some of the regions, as well as in some of the other directorates, like cultural resources or water, or John Gross. John, we support John's position in INM. So it's this idea of trying to have a very lean core team of experts, but then supporting the development of climate change within the other, trying to have some strings attached, but within other areas. So this is accessible with more information, contact information on our general website, www.nps.gov/climate change. And this is also a link to the My Green Parks, which is the main site for our sustainability or sustainable operations program. And other than that, I'd be happy to take questions.
like you've really developed your thinking and planning for developing scenarios and management plans in all of your parks. And I was wondering how you engage other land managers surrounding parks, particularly those that are sort of like an island of other land management, if they're maybe not quite as advanced in their climate change thinking or research.
Yeah. Do you have any particular example or just in general?
In general.
Yeah. Every workshop that we've done has had neighbors partner, whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service or the Forest Service. We certainly, I think probably everyone has had USGS scientists that participate in one way or the other. We work with folks from NOAA. It's a great question. It's really important. And we can't force it, obviously, so we invite them. But the parks, we do like to have, sort of parks at, in a sense, at the centerpiece, because we're a Park Service organization. And oftentimes the parks have that highest level of protection associated with them as well. So we work with the parks to identify who their key partners are. And I would say, if we do a workshop of 30 people, at least 10 of them are going to be, at least a third of them are going to be non-Park Service, generally up to about half will be non-Park Service people. Not always other government entities, but, and then another example, Jeff was just participated in one that we had here in Fort Collins, which was more on the development of technique, but that was very purposefully sort of I won't say more multi-jurisdictional, but multi-agency in order to sort of expand our thinking about, is this relevant for others, and if so, how, and how can we work with you, whether it's directly on a landscape or just sharing approaches, because we need to be working together in our thinking on these and leveraging non-parallel processing. It's a great question. It's very important.
A decent share of academics, I think.
Yeah, always. Yeah, when we do for scenario planning, they sort of say you need three kinds of people. You need your experts, your knowledge holders, and oftentimes for climate change, those are key scientists, but also other knowledge holders. You need your stakeholders that can make a decision, and then you need curious and creative. So it's a balance, and hopefully you've got your scientists fulfill at least two of those. But anybody else?
Good question. On slide 13, I think it was, the four-step process or framework.
Yep.
Starting with your
Get
decision.
There we go.
Framing the issue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, it has the blue arrow kind of going back once you have plan, implementation, and action.
Yeah.
And how much, when you frame the issue, and even in the structured decision-making class as part of the material does, asks you to consider what options are available to someone. So it's almost like even before you frame the issue, you're already looking at that.
You mean like sort of restoration or those types of adaptation options? Yeah, yeah.
And in some ways, that could limit your thinking.
Yeah.
Because you kind of want to maybe be outside the box.
Yeah.
But on the other end of that spectrum is you come up with a solution and somebody says, I can't do that. That's we could thin every forest and put an acre between it, and we'd stop fires from happening in the Rocky Mountains. Figure out, okay, but we don't have
Not going to do that.
$1 trillion, and we're not going to do it
Right.
anyway. So, I think it's a balance.
Like a feasibility. Yeah. Yeah.
How much does that come into that first step?
We try not to do it for the very reason that you said. Now, that said, we often will have kind of that list, and we will work it in, but not necessarily under the framing, because you are trying to explore potential space, and even if you're exploring something that ultimately you won't be able to do, it's like, I think the example on fire is a really good one, and we're pushing the envelope on this. We've done it a little bit looking at Yellowstone. I've been working with Tony Westerling on thinking about fire in some of these, conifer systems, and I think that's a legitimate question. And when you think about the big matrix and the big problems and solutions, that's the hardest one to walk out, because you say, let's take climate change in its full-blown manifestation, which in many cases is a complete transformation of a forest, for example. and you go, if that's where we're headed, what are the actions we can take now? And you're right, for fire, they're pretty extreme, but we feel it's worth the exercise to say this is what it would take, and to ask the question of whether it's feasible or not. You need to get that laid out on the table, because if that's what it would take and it isn't feasible, then you need people to go, okay, well, what is? And if you don't do that collectively, if you don't get the fire guys in the room, then you're just going to be saying, well, we need to do this, or we need to do that, or we can't, but you don't ever get to, well, what is feasible? No action is an action. So if you want to get people to some action, you have to put some things out of the way, and you kind of have to walk through it logically to get them there. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Even if it isn't feasible, you kind of have to go there.
Nature constrains us enough.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to, everybody's going to think about feasible, almost be constrained by the world they live in, what's reasonable.
That's right. And there are things that people don't want to consider. I showed a picture early on of Koloko Honokahau, which is a cultural resource park in Hawaii. And we're going back there actually in November to work with them a little more closely. And what this is these are fish ponds, right, that have been there. The Hawaiians have built the fish ponds so that when the storms come in, the fish come over and then they're trapped. It's very ingenious, and then they've got access to them. So now they're being preserved as a part of this natural and cultural park. And sea level rise is obviously threatening the existence of this structure, which is constantly maintained in relationship with the native Hawaiians. And they've got a lot of other issues. They've got, they're a small park along the coast. They've got all this development right behind them. They don't have any place to go with the park. And getting a park like this to talk about these big picture, what do you do if you get completely inundated? And they're like, they don't even want to talk about it. But you can work with their partners and you say, well, what's the basis of this park? It demonstrates the relationship of the indigenous culture with the natural environment, how they work with and use the natural environment. So can we still exemplify that? Can we still talk about that somewhere? It's really hard to get people to move away and say, okay, if this, the things I don't want to think about, if they happen, does that mean the whole thing goes away? There's no meaning, there's no value. There are actually a lot of options, is what I'm trying to get at. There really are. It's not what you want, but you could interpret it. You could look for another location. There are things that you could do to still preserve the basic piece that you're trying to. So that's just another example in terms of cultural resources. It's just, if you don't explore it, you don't make yourself go there, you won't come up with any alternatives.
You talked about this implementation of refinement of scenario planning into a planning process for a park. I was wondering if you have examples, given the multiple plans that Park Service has and how often they're going through these processes. Do you have an example where they actually put in
That information.
scenario planning and put it into a park plan?
Yeah.
And do you think that is critical, or will informal processes get you there if you haven't seen that happen?
So I think it is critical, and there are several examples. They're not always as explicit as you might be thinking. So one example is back to Assateague Island and their general management plan. So they went through scenario planning, and they have incorporated the scenarios and what they've learned into the plan, but it's not in a way that says under scenario 1, parched ponies. They don't do that. They don't line it out exactly as they defined it. So it's maybe hybrid of, I think, what you're asking, so that the process gets you there, informs your thinking, and then you use that information, hopefully explicitly with the science, in your planning process. But it's not a one-to-one, this scenario becomes an alternative, or they don't do it in a one-to-one relationship. And I wouldn't encourage them to do that, because part of getting your thinking around different scenarios is the storytelling, and there are things that you do to try to walk it out mentally, and that wouldn't always translate exactly into a plan that So it's more. So let me give you another example. So Assateague is incorporated it. Another one is Kenai Fjords, which I've talked about, and that's the other spectrum where no, they haven't moved it directly into a specific plan, But what they do, the park superintendent up there, Jeff Mount, he's got his scenarios sitting on the wall, and he floats his decisions through it. So he uses the scenarios like a wind tunneling exercise. When something happens, and he thinks about, why did this happen? Like our road just got washed out again to exit Glacier. Now it's happening every year. It used to happen every 10 years. Now it's every year, you know. Is it climate change? Is it natural variability? Should I go back and rebuild the road? You know, so those types of things. He looks at these scenarios and uses his judgment based on, you know, still uncertain, but based on the work that we did. So yeah, we are explicitly moving it in some cases. In other cases, it's used to kind of inform processes. Another specific example is in Sequoia Kings Canyon. We've done that whole sort of end-to-end process with vulnerability assessments and scenarios, very explicitly aiming it at a fire management plan that they're doing in coordination with the Forest Service down there. So not done yet, but those scenarios will very explicitly do it. So we're getting examples. But sometimes it's not as direct as people might want it to be. But I'm not sure that, I think both of those are important. I think in some cases to be directly explicit, but other times it just changes the way you think in a way that might not be quantifiable, but is still really valuable. So, yeah.
Are there any formal mechanisms for transferring innovations from individual parts, like for example the parking lot example you showed, or even an educational sort of display that worked really well? Is there any sort of formal mechanism for
From park to park?
Yeah.
Yeah. We just started this year a pilot as part of our training, superintendent training on climate change. And the way we're doing that is to have our climate leaders, our superintendents, and Trish Kickleiter at Assateague is one of them, the ones that are starting to implement these kinds of actions. We're asking them to present to their peers. So it's a training for new superintendents, and we're calling on individual, more seasoned superintendents to share their examples. So it's formal training, but it's done as a peer-to-peer, here's what I did. And we think that probably works better than having us tell them what they should do, because, you know, they want to be challenged by each other. So, yeah. So that's our first start. We're hoping to work on that a little bit more.
All right, well,